Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to chat through the idea of fan fiction becoming published works. And this is something that I've wanted to have a conversation about for a while, ever since I read one of the books that I'll mention in this video. But I also didn't quite know how I wanted to go about this because it's a difficult topic, because I think instinctively a lot of people hear fan fiction getting published and have a lot of negative thoughts about that. And I think a lot of people also start to decide that if you are pulling a little too much inspiration from something, that you are plagiarizing. And I think that's a very serious word to apply to any author's work. I think it's about one of the most serious things that you can throw at an author's work. And I don't quite know how to navigate even my own thoughts on this. And so this video is going to be very conversational. It's going to be, of course, one-sided because you can't talk at the same time. You can, of course, leave your comments, and I actually would love to know your thoughts on this. I am, as I go through the video, going to be going in order of the most related of stories, meaning the thing that is the inspiration. How much is being taken from that is going to increase with the 3 examples that I have in this video that we'll go through. I want to start by saying, though, that I by no means am trying to impose my thoughts onto anyone else. I just feel that this is an interesting topic. I think it's something that is shifting, I guess you could say, the landscape of publishing, especially in fantasy, or at least maybe because I primarily read fantasy, it's where I see it the most. But I don't quite know the differences of when it's crossing a line and when it's just paying homage, and when it's giving nods to, and when it's kind of sort of acknowledging what's come before and then building from there into something unique and doing something different. There are instances where it is, in a sense, a compliment. In a sense, it is a respectful thing. And in other instances, it feels as though you are just profiting off of somebody else's work. And I want to be clear that I'm not referring to mythology retellings. I'm not referring to retellings, because that's a whole other thing. Retellings often are taking something that has been established and known and told many times over, and now we are just we're utilizing the foundation, and then we are building from there. We are taking certain stories sometimes that the time in which they were written caused a certain perception of certain characters in the story, or there were certain themes that were present that from the lens of today, we might want to re-examine. We might want to do something interesting with a certain character. Sometimes retellings are looking at the villain and asking, are they actually villainous? Or is it just that they are a villain in their time? Would they actually be a hero now? Why are they seen as so awful when in actuality they're very complex, and they're somebody who, of course they would behave that way, look what's been done to them. So there's really interesting things you can do with retellings. But I'm not talking about retellings. I'm talking about works that there are things that have been released, that the creators are alive now, and their works have not been out for that long, and then something else comes out that is clearly inspired by those works, and it is very clearly inspired by those works, I guess you could say. It's just very much, it's pulling from that in a way that I don't even know if it could exist if not for all the things they are taking from the original. The first example is actually not a fantasy story, but it is pulled from a science fiction, a sci-fantasy story, and that would be The Love Hypothesis. And this is, funny enough, the one that I see the most negativity assigned to it based off of what it's inspired by. And it is inspired by the idea of shipping Kylo Ren and Rey from Star Wars. And I just want to get this out of the way. I'm not a Star Wars person. I don't know anything about this ship. It's like the one franchise that, as I feel like fantasy fan who's always been really into this kind of stuff, I have never gotten into it. So I just want to be very clear that I'm not the best person when it comes to being able to pick apart why some people feel like this is too blatant of a copy and why other people feel differently. But from what I understand, and also because I have eyeballs and they describe the characters in the book so many times, the main inspiration is the appearance of the characters and the idea of the grump and the sunshine. So The Love Hypothesis, if you don't know, it is a romance story, contemporary romance that follows a young woman who is in STEM, and she is getting her, she's furthering her education, and she ends up in a fake relationship with another academic individual, another person who is a little bit higher up in the college, the university that she goes to, and so many people hate this guy, and so many people feel like he's so mean and he's so awful, and she's just bumbling silly girl, and she thinks like, he doesn't like me, he hates me, but he has to keep dating me because of reasons. I won't get into the specifics because they're not really important to the point of this this video. With this couple, the guy is described basically exactly like Kylo Ren. He's tall, he has dark hair, he's got broad shoulders, he's just so massive, he's just an enormous guy. And then the girl is described as having kind of brownish hair, and she's thin, and you get it. And if you just look at the cover of The Love Hypothesis and you look at those actors, you can see the parallels. But that's like, from what I can tell, where the parallels end. If you didn't tell me that this was inspired by those characters and you just tweaked their appearances a little bit, then I would have no idea that there was inspiration taken from that ship. The plot is very different. The genre is very different. I don't think Kylo Ren, I don't think that they're like, we have to pretend we're dating in order to save the galaxy. I mean, I don't think that that is the setup for, it's very different. But I see very often in reviews, it's just Reylo fan fiction. And I guess we're just publishing fan fiction these days. And you will see a lot of those sorts of things thrown at this book. And it surprises me because the next two examples are much more closely related to the thing they are taking inspiration from. The thing that all three of these, if I'm not mistaken, have in common is I believe the authors themselves have openly said that they are inspired by the thing that they're inspired by. So in this case, Kylo Ren and Rey. The next example is going to be Castlevania. And then the third example is going to be Full Metal Alchemist. Where I don't see the inspiration being mentioned is in publishing and in the printing of the books. And it makes me wonder legally, can they even say it? Because can they admit that it is that closely related? Do they want to admit that? And it's interesting that the authors themselves will say it, but it doesn't seem like the marketing wants to. So the next example, like I said, is going to be related to Castlevania. So I just finished this book recently, and that would be Silver Under Nightfall. The comparisons to Castlevania primarily come down to the fact that they're both dealing with vampires and the characters themselves, two of which I would say are much closer related to the characters in Castlevania than the third character. So the two characters that are the most alike are based off of Trevor and Alucard. Those characters are very similar. So when I first started this book, I actually thought, I'm like, oh, this is giving me Castlevania vibes. Vampires are not an original thing. So I can't claim that this book is inspired by, there's like these things that drink people's blood. You know, vampires are a thing. That's very different. That's like a known being in fantasy that we see all the time. However, the general feeling of these characters, these two in particular, is so similar. So Alucard, I don't want to say too much about Castlevania if you haven't watched it, but let's just say Alucard is of notable birth, I'll say. And the character in this book, the vampire, is considered a noble vampire. There is no Dracula figure necessarily in this one, whereas in Castlevania, specifically the Netflix adaptation, I want to be specific there because there are also games. And then the Netflix adaptation is an adaptation of those games. So I'm talking about the Netflix show. In this book, there's no Dracula figure like there is in the show, which is a main antagonist for a lot of the series. So that is different. And then we have Remy, the Trevor counterpart, we'll call them. Even their weaponry is basically exactly the same. You have like the chain with the knife on the end of it. And this character's family has been known to be monster hunters, or specifically vampire hunters. And Trevor's family in Castlevania are monster hunters, vampire hunters. They are very skilled when it comes to fighting, almost in a way that makes people wonder if there's more going on, and it actually causes, in Castlevania, the church is a big thing in that show, and they somewhat shun Trevor's family because they believe that their family gained their prowess through things that they shouldn't have. And you also see, for different reasons, not through the church necessarily, but political rivals and such things, you see Remy's family has been sort of cast out to some degree. They still hold a lot of influence, and they're still notable within their society, but there is that sense of they have been cast out. And like I said, the weaponry specifically, I was like, so this is Trevor. And then we have the third character, the female character in the story. So in Castlevania, I'm spacing on how to pronounce her name. Sypha, right? That's how you say it. It's been a long time since I've watched that show. I need to rewatch it because that second season is so good. But that's besides the point. So Sypha's character, her counterpart in this, the least like her. They're both, I would say, the more sunshine, happy, within the dynamics of these three characters. They're the ones that are like, hey, everybody, let's just get along. And because you do see the two male characters butting heads in Castlevania, and I'd say in this as well, you see them butting heads, but there's also this fierce protectiveness in this character. So some of the personality is similar, but the description of this character is very different. And in Castlevania, she is very skilled with magic, and in this, it's another vampire. So there are some differences. And to sum up, this is basically like, what if those three characters, what if they all wanted to have sex with each other? What would that look like? That's Silver Under Nightfall. So there's a lot of romantic tension in this, and the plots are very different. So I was saying in Castlevania, you see that Dracula is one of the main antagonists. It's much more apocalyptic. People are dying left and right. Whereas in this, it's somewhat of a mystery because there is this thing known as rot that is making it so that rogue vampires who have been killed are starting to come back to life, but with less of their humanity. And when you go to kill them, they keep on healing, and each time they come back, they have less and less of their humanity until they're just these mindless monsters who just go on these feeding frenzies. And so they're trying to determine the cause of the rot. So the plot is actually pretty cool. I do think the plot eventually kind of falls off a little bit because we do get into that, what if these three wanted to do it with each other? That's the plot now. And so it felt more like fan fiction once we actually started to see more of the romantic elements of the story playing out. But again, the plots are very, very different. So I put this one in the middle because while the characters themselves are very clearly inspired by Castlevania, I think the plots are different enough, but I still came away from it. At the end of the day, I was like, well, now I just want to go watch Castlevania. Does that make sense? I didn't necessarily think like, wow, what a great nod to Castlevania and what a cool, interesting, it did its own, because the characters for me were a little too similar. The last one is the most extreme example of this. And there's actually a negative review that showcases a lot of the specifics very well. So I'm going to pull from that review. When I read the book is A Far Wilder Magic, I had somebody actually recommended to me because they said, I know that you're a big fan of Full Metal Alchemist, and I'm specifically holding up these volumes because of the characters that are on these volumes. They told me, I know you're a big fan of Full Metal Alchemist, you should try A Far Wilder Magic. And I was like, oh, okay, anything. Just tell me anything that's like Full Metal, and I'll be like, throw it at me, I want to read it. So I picked it up, and I was like, it's exactly like Full Metal Alchemist. It's so like Full Metal Alchemist that I was, the further in I was reading, the more and more uncomfortable I became, to a point where I almost was like, I don't even know if I want to mention this book because I just didn't, I don't know how to describe it. This is why I was saying at the beginning, there's not necessarily a strong, firm opinion that I'm trying to be like, this is how I feel, everybody. I feel very strongly about this. It's more of like, I don't feel comfortable with it, I guess is the best way to say it. I don't feel comfortable with it, but I don't know how to define that line of taking inspiration from, because if you've heard anything in this video and thought, I'm not okay with any of this, but you're a fan of Wheel of Time, it definitely has taken inspiration from the things that have come before. It's taken inspiration from Lord of the Rings. It's taken inspiration from Dune. You have certain things that are very similar. And there's many, many, many instances in fantasy, like I said at the beginning, specifically fantasy, because that's what I read primarily. So many instances of things being inspired by something else. So I don't want to act as though these books that I'm talking about, or these stories, are doing some great injustice to other stories and other works, when there have been things that are, I always say if you like it, you usually go, it pays such respects to the greats that came before. And if you dislike it, you say it's really derivative. It's basically fan fiction. And so you can change the tone of what you're saying when in actuality, sometimes you're saying very similar things. It just depends on how much you enjoyed the story. Anyway, long story short, this one is the most extreme example I've ever seen. And I'm going to, like I said, look at that one review because they mapped it out very, very well. When I read this, I was like, I cannot be the only person who enjoys reading fantasy books, both young adult and adult, and also loves Fullmetal Alchemist. I can't be the only one. Somebody else knows this, and somebody else has definitely commented on it, and that's what this review did. I will say, there are positive reviews that have commented on it. There are positive reviews that are like, this is the Roy and Risa fan fiction of my dreams. And I'm like, really? Because I feel weird. I feel weird being like, this is fan fiction and I love it. Because I'm like, Arakawa is still alive. This work isn't that old. It's strange to me. Anyway, so if you don't know anything about Fullmetal Alchemist, it follows these two brothers, Edward and Alphonse, who they are trying to regain their bodies because they have lost parts of themselves through a failed experiment with alchemy where they tried to bring their mother back from the dead. So on surface level, when you hear that description, it doesn't sound like it would be similar at all to this book's description. But that's because this book is not about Edward and Alphonse. It's about Roy and Risa. That's not their names in the book. The names are, of course, changed. But it's about them. It's about what Arakawa references or alludes to about their pasts. But mixed in are basically exact phrases and scenes from Fullmetal Alchemist. So it's really, I was like, there's a specific one that is something like, all is one and one is all. And that was put in this book as a principle of alchemy. And I'm like, what? And it's called alchemy. The magic is called alchemy in both. The settings are almost exactly the same, where it's a much more modern setting. It's a very militaristic society. They call the alchemists state alchemists like they do in Fullmetal Alchemist. So anyway, like I said, this other person gave a lot of really specific examples. So I'm going to reference their review. And they even say, I definitely needed to read the book to decide whether the similarities were homage to Fullmetal Alchemist and its characters, or a blatant ripoff. And so I didn't even notice that part before, but looking at it just now. So they're saying very similar things to what I was saying earlier in the video. But the main characters themselves. So the main characters' names are Wes and Maggie in A Far Wilder Magic. And it says they look exactly like Roy Mustang and Risa Hawkeye, down to so many character-specific details that anyone who is familiar with Fullmetal would notice them from a mile away. And so the reason, like I said, I pulled these up is so that I could hold these while you were listening to the descriptions. Maggie is a blonde-haired and brown, she has blonde hair and brown eyes. She wears her hair pinned up with a tortoiseshell barrette. She's strict and headstrong and very organized. Did I mention that she's also a sharpshooter? You would think I'm just describing this character. And because I am, that's who it is. And then it talks about her background. Maggie lives alone in a shoddy, abandoned manor in the countryside. Her mother is a renowned alchemist who buried herself in her alchemical research after the death of Maggie's brother and the subsequent disappearance of Maggie's father, to the point that she ended up neglecting Maggie and eventually disappearing on her to pursue clues about the Philosopher's Stone. Maggie is thus left to tend to their house alone until her mother returns. That is where Wes finds her when he visits their town in hopes of scoring an apprenticeship under Maggie's mother. And then they talk about how that is very similar to her backstory from Fullmetal, Risa Hawkeye's backstory. Because her backstory is that after the death of her mother, her father, a renowned alchemist, buries himself in his research to the point of neglecting Risa, their house, and his own health. And Risa is left to tend to their empty countryside manor alone until Roy appears on their doorstep, hoping to score an apprenticeship under Master Hawkeye. It's so similar. It's so incredibly similar. I guess the difference is that all of this is kind of, like I said, alluded to in Fullmetal, but you don't really see too much of it. But you know that is the backstory, and so this is kind of taking what's been alluded to and it's fleshing it out. So is that unique, or is that still not unique enough? That's the question. Now we get to the other character, Roy. says, as for Weston, that's the character's name in this book. As for Weston, I think the similarities are even more uncanny here. Wes has black hair that is very specifically described to be shorn close at the nape, but with a messy fringe he likes to slick back when he wants to look more put together. He has dark brown/black eyes, a round boyish face, and a long black trench coat he loves to drape over his shoulders like a cape. And then this reviewer says this is especially funny because Roy's coat is practically a meme in the fandom. There are literal memes about how Roy can't wear his coat properly. There's even a blog dedicated to the coat. So those similarities already are very uncanny. And the character, when it comes to his magic, he in Full Metal is the flame alchemist. And this character in this story uses flame alchemy. And they even draw the transmutation circles. They have a scene, like I said, that is within the backstory of one of the characters in the book that is basically a scene with Edward and Alphonse in Full Metal Alchemist. And then this reviewer lists off a lot of the specifics as well that are not necessarily exactly related to these characters. So it says the setting both are set in a 1920s America-ish world. There are a few vague mentions of the country's history, enacting expansive politics, conquering other nations, which you see very much in Full Metal with something known as the Ishvalan War. So there's a lot of things to do with that. The alchemical terminology used in this book is basically the same as Full Metal. And they mention the thing that I said, one is all and all is one. It's part from Full Metal. And it says the principle of one is all and all is one does not exist in historical alchemy. It was made up by Arakawa. And that's the thing, is that the Philosopher's Stone is mentioned in both, but obviously the Philosopher's Stone is not unique to Full Metal. That phrase, I looked into it after this to see, I was like, is this something that, is it like the Philosopher's Stone where it's a concept that has been applied to alchemy? And it would appear not. If you type that in, it is very obviously tied to, or at least made popular by, Arakawa's Full Metal. And I want to add that after this, I was like, I'm going to see if maybe it's acknowledged by the author. And again, the author herself says it's like if you mixed Full Metal and the Scorpio races. Because there's certain plot things, not necessarily character backstories or descriptions, but plot elements that's like a competition. And that's not anything related to Full Metal Alchemist. So I do want to make that clear. But she acknowledges that it's similar. But if you look, there is a post about when she first read Full Metal Alchemist, and I think it was about a year or so after that she announced that she had a new book coming out called A Far Wilder Magic. And if you know anything about the writing process, about publishing, you know it takes a while to write a book. So the timeline is she reads Full Metal, and it feels like writes fan fiction of Roy and Risa, and then publishing decides to back that book. And the reason I don't like throwing authors necessarily under the bus is because publishing, I don't know legally, I don't know the specifics behind when something is considered a retelling, when something is different enough that it's not considered fan fiction, but they know, they definitely know, or they should. And so if they are saying to this author, like, no, it's different enough, the plot is different, you've got this interesting hunt aspect to the story, and you're fleshing out a few things that sure are inspired by this, but you take it in your own direction, and you tie in a religious element to the characters, and you're looking more at their families and things like that you don't see in Full Metal. So it's different enough. If publishing is telling the author that, which I don't know what conversations are being had, but if publishing is telling the author that, then how are they to know that I don't know if I'm making sense. Or where I'm going with this is plenty of authors have drawn inspiration from, and it's been fine and nobody has cared. So when are they supposed to know if they've crossed the line when publishing is backing them, when publishing is wanting to market their books, when publishing is wanting to work really hard to make sure it's edited and it gets a good cover? And like, how are they supposed to know if they've crossed the line if the professionals are telling them, nope, you got the green light, you're all good to go? Anyway, I wanted to mention a few of the other similarities that are here. So they have a conversation. It's another scene. They have a conversation where in Full Metal Alchemist, Roy is trying to climb the political ladder, because he feels that he can change things from the inside. And he has this very powerful kind of alchemy, flame alchemy. And Risa she always has his back. She's the sharpshooter. She's not an alchemist, but she always has his back. And she will back him in his pursuit of his goals unless he crosses the line, unless he starts to become corrupt. And then the idea and the kind of agreement between these two characters and part of their trust with one another is that if he ever crosses that line, she'll take him out. She is not going to let somebody with the amount of power that he has be in a position to rule if he's going to do so in a corrupt way. And there is a scene where Risa is basically pointing her gun at Roy and saying, if you go down this path, I will have to stop you. And there's that exact scene in this book. So again, some reviewers think, they're like, oh, I loved it. I loved that it's exactly what I've always wanted from Roy and Risa. And then there's people like me and this person who left this review that are like, it's so alike. I don't know how to feel about this. I have not decided where that line falls. I just know when I'm not comfortable with it. And with that last example, that was one that I was not comfortable with. With Silver Under Nightfall, I felt like there was enough about it that was unique, that stood on its own. But ultimately, I still felt like once you took away some of the blueprints, the plot actually, I think, suffered a little bit. I think the pacing suffered a little bit. And to repeat myself, I just wanted to go watch Castlevania again. And then, funny enough, the one that I think gets negativity thrown at it the most for being fan fiction is the one that's least like the thing it's inspired by. So I'm just curious your thoughts on this topic. I'm curious what examples that you have, but anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.